Okay, perfect. Um, let's start again then. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for making it today. What I aim to do in this session is essentially walk you through the first speaker role. What is it that you're supposed to do when you're either prime minister or leader of opposition? Um, Essentially, your role both in an AP and BP is the same, more or less. So I wouldn't make any differentiation on that front. Briefly tell you about what should be the contents of your speeches, um, a bit about what you should be doing during prep, etc. What's the difference while you're prepping for prime minister, while you're prepping for leader of opposition, as well as a little bit about the member speeches if you're doing a BP. Okay, cool. Let's start then. So I think the first thing that you need to do, and this is during prep, is essentially to write down everything. I think I've said this before, but I think it is especially important for first speakers to have their speeches written down in as much detail as I can. Now, I don't mean that you need to write down everything word to word as you would speak it, but definitely not just headings or very cryptic notes, right? Of course, you would devise your own way for note making according to what suits you, but you would definitely want to write down as much analysis as you possibly can get down on paper, as much as you can, essentially. Okay, cool. So I think what some debaters like to do is to have two papers. One is a scrap page and one is the one where you write your final notes. I personally don't do that. I think I explained my note making before. But for the benefit of the people who weren't here, what I usually do as first speaker is I have a few sections on my sheet. So for instance, if my first heading is characterization, I'll write down that as a heading. I'll write down my key characterization factors. I leave a little bit of space because in most instances, I will revisit it and add a few things. Then I'll write my next argument, write down a few analysis, like whatever little analysis, few sentences. I'll leave some space again, and so on and so forth. I usually like to have one sheet, one long one, and then, if it spills over to another one, then like something like that, perhaps. But I usually don't do the whole two paper thing. But if that's something that works for you, some people basically they have a scrap paper in which they write down anything and everything they discuss during prep, and in the last few minutes they transfer all of the relevant stuff that they're going to actually speak during their speech to the main sheet. That is something, if it works for you, that you can definitely try it out. So essentially, this is what you're going to do during your prep, right? And I think your role during prep as first speaker is to basically just ask a lot of questions. Because like I said, logically, if you're the one making the most notes, you wouldn't have time to contribute, to take the lead on prep, because you can't be the one who's bouncing off ideas. You have to be the one who's finding the loopholes in the ideas and prompting your partners and telling them that, okay, this is where we miss analysis, there's a missing link here, perhaps this is something we need to add to characterization, or perhaps this is a little bit of what do you say, comparative that we lack here, or something like that, right? So that's what you should be doing during prep. Okay, let's get down to what you're supposed to do during your speech then, right? And I think there are a few things. I think the first thing that you uniquely do is that you set the context, which is basically the why, where, and when of the debate. I think the idea behind context setting is that what you're essentially doing is you are giving down a framework for the debate, like a basic foundation for the debate to begin at. But it has to be done in a way which is convenient to your side, right? So, for example, let's take the example of a motion, right? Say you're debating on something like something along, say, rainbow capitalism, right? And say you're regretting rainbow capitalism. Rainbow capitalism is basically just, all of the huge gimmicks and advertisements that these huge corporations do during Pride Month. Like during that Pride Month, they'll probably just come up with like new schemes or, things like that to support uh, the members of the LGBTQ community. And there's a whole debate around that, basically on whether it's tokenistic or not, whether you should have it or not, etc., etc. Right? So, how would you say characterize that from Gov, right? If you're regretting rainbow washing, the way I would perhaps characterize it is, is to say that, look, these are corporations we know who have been doing a lot of bad things. We know that these corporations do not have any good incentives in mind. They're always going to be profit oriented. They're always going to be profit oriented because that's the way that they're ever going to sustain, right? Like that's the bedrock of capitalism, essentially. So you can never actually expect them to be altruistic, because if they stop making money or if they stop minting money, then they wouldn't exist in the first place, right? So you see what I'm doing there with the characterization, right? I'm essentially describing a company, or I'm essentially describing what capitalism looks like, but I'm doing it in a way that's favorable to me. I'm saying these are profit oriented companies. I'm saying that they're never going to stop, because the only way that they can sustain is if they mint more money for the more like upper tier people, is if they underpay their workers and if they make them live in miserable conditions. That's the only way that they can actually make more than what they're offering, right? So that's a bit of convenient characterization right there. So technically, I'm trying to describe to you what capitalism or big corporations look like, but it's convenient to my side of the house, because then I can like flow it into my next argumentation and talk about how they tend to be really tokenistic in nature, etc., etc. Right? So this is a bit of convenient context setting. What I mean by context setting. Another thing you must remember about setting the context, and this is something that I feel like most people miss, at least in the beginning, is try and make your context setting or characterization as detailed as you can. So for instance, if you're, say, you're debating about women's rights or it's a feminist motion, and you want to describe the patriarchal structure, I've seen a lot of teams, usually they'll probably just talk about why the patriarchy is bad. It's whatever structure that oppresses women, etc., etc. Now that's a characterization that's fine, but it's extremely surface level. You want a characterization to be as detailed as possible. So depending upon the motion, you would want to give specific instances of why something happens and why something doesn't, right? So for instance, if, I don't know, it's like something about like how homemakers or housemakers or something, you would want to narrow it down to those specific stakeholders. You understand what I'm saying? My point basically is that you don't want to be extremely vague, right? So for instance, if the motion is, say, about paying homemakers for their services or something like that, you don't want to talk about just patriarchy in general. You want to talk about how that affects this particular woman and the shape or form patriarchy takes while affecting this specific woman, right? So your characterization needs to be really, really detailed and specific to that extent. So a quick hack to perhaps characterize would be to look at a few things, right? First is, who is this exercise or motion affecting and how many people is it affecting? You want to try and make it affect a lot of people, so your impacts are going to stand in the debate. You can perhaps show that it affects the most vulnerable stakeholder, or that it affects people who are extremely relevant to that exercise, right? So you want to be thinking about these people when you're thinking about who to set this motion about or where to place set it and things like that. Another thing that most people miss while setting the context is to prove the relevance of it. People often forget to do this, right? So for instance, if it's like, I don't know, if it's like any motion on, say, I don't know, like I can't think of a motion at the top of my head, but say for instance you want to, like, in your head you're place setting this motion in, say, a developing country, right? Whereas it could be set anywhere and it's not specified in the motion, you want to set it in a developing country. You have to explain the reasons for why that's the case. Perhaps you're sitting in a developing country because it has the most impact on those people over there as compared to some other people around the world. Or perhaps that it is, it probably would have, it would exist in a way which it would exist in a more meaningful way if the debate would happen in a developing country. It would be extremely convenient in a developed country, something like that. For instance, let's take an IR motion, right? Like if it's a motion about like democracy or something like that, you wouldn't want to set it in China and say that, look, we're regretting this motion because it's set in China and that like nothing can ever happen in China. For a debate to meaningfully want to take place, you perhaps want to set it in a developing country, something like in India, where there's a possibility of a democracy existing, but there are some challenges to it, or something like that. Like my point basically is that you have to prove the relevance of it, and it becomes super easy. I remember there was this one time when we were debating, and a team, I don't remember what the motion was exactly, but the team very conveniently set it in the US and said that, oh, this can never happen in the US because US is a super liberal country, etc. And then we had to like recontextualize it and say that no, this debate can't exist in the US for XYZ reasons, right? So in order to avoid all of that, you have to explain the relevance of why you're placing the motion where it is, why the debate would perhaps most meaningfully pan out in the context that you're setting in, or perhaps that it could affect the most number of people in the place that you want it to, or the most vulnerable people in the place you want it to, right? So that's about setting the context. The second thing that you want to do is set burdens, right? Or give burdens. What burdens basically mean in simple language is what is it that you aim to achieve and what is it that the other side has to prove in order to win the debate, right? Quick thing about burdens, they have to be quite achievable. Don't make them extremely difficult or don't make it something that's really hard to achieve. I've seen people take upon burdens like, okay, you know what, we'll be making the world a better place to live in, or we're going to live in peace and harmony, etc. Don't ever take up burdens like those. Those are unachievable things and quite weak. You'll never be able to solve the world's problems, right? So take upon burdens which are something that you will likely be able to solve. So for instance, just to say that, look, if it's like a motion about, say, minorities, we just want to give them a better platform to speak out, or a better platform to mobilize and collectivize, or a better chance of being heard. That's the burden you want to take upon yourself. That's a reasonable burden, right? You can't just say that, oh, at the end of my speech, I'll be proving that the world is going to be an extremely safe haven for minorities to live in. That's never going to happen, okay? And in fact, the higher burden you take upon yourself, the better it is to point for the other side to be able to point holes in your case, because unachievable things are going to be unachievable to prove as well. So basically that. So what burdens have to do essentially is they have to be the focal point of your argumentation, right? Which means basically that whatever you prove has to be furthering your burden or furthering the path to achieving what you set out to do. It's quite simple, right? Like it's not that complex particularly. You can also use burden pushing as an offensive strategy against other teams, right? So you can say that, okay, this is what the opposition houses have to prove in order to win, or they won't perhaps win unless and until they prove X, Y, Z things, something like that, right? So you can also push burdens from first speaker. Cool. The next thing you want to do from your first speech is models, okay? Models are like, they're not like super important. They're not like the most important thing in your speech. But if you don't give them, it's likely that the other team will just unnecessarily make the debate messy, you know. So it's just necessary to be there. What you want to do in a model essentially, okay, what is a model basically? I don't know how to explain what a model is, except for to give you an example, right? So for instance, if it's a policy motion, you want to implement like XYZ policy, it could be anything at all. So in policy motions, usually you want to form a model, right? You will say that, okay, look, this for this model, we'll probably have a separate governmental body in which you're going to have non-elected representatives or experts in the field who are going to contribute. They're probably going to be audited by the government at a regular basis and be accountable to the people, something like that, right? So that would be a model. So, like, okay, the policy is going to be carried out by these individuals. If you don't give this model, the other team will be like, oh, you know what? You're going to have like officials from the government who are going to implement this policy. And since they're extreme bigots, they're going to completely like mess it up and be super majoritarian, right? In order to avoid all the confusion, you just say that, look, this is what we intend to do. We'll have a panel of experts who we're going to set up. We're going to probably have a budget that is going to go out for these, for this specific project or something like that, right? Now, remember that models have to be extremely reasonable, okay? And you can't really model your way out of an argument, okay? So you can't just say that, this argument of that house doesn't stand because we are going to just model it out. We're just going to say that, if say the other side is making an argument that, perhaps there's a good chance that this committee that you're setting up will be a lot biased because it's being audited by the government from time to time, or there's a chance that the government might put their own representatives who are favorable to them, etc., etc. You can't just be like, no, that's not going to happen because we said so, and we're going to make sure our model is impartial. No, so you can only take your model so far. You have to still give me incentives if the other side is pushing this argument and why there's going to be bias in that committee, etc. You still have to prove to me incentives and why that perhaps won't be the case, right? So that's just like a little bit about the model. Like, it's a good base for your policy to work or for a motion to work, but that is all about it. There's no argumentative nature of it per se. Okay, cool. Don't model too much as well. You don't want to model crucial parts out of it. But okay, cool. I think that is about it. Let's look at how do you analyze and characterize key actors and stuff, right? Which is also very commonly known as stakeholder analysis, which is nothing but just analyzing the actors in your case. Okay, so I think that the first thing you need to remember is your actors are very, very going to be very, very closely interlinked with your arguments, right? So basically what you're going to do in this section is going to be the meat of your matter. Is going to be your key argumentation. But the way you do it from first speaker is going to be slightly different, right? The first thing you have to do is try and identify who are key actors in your motion, or who are the individuals or groups of people or stakeholders rather who are going to be affected, right? So it could be women, it could be minorities, it could be certain countries in an IR motion, it could be workers in an econ motion, or it could be an entire economy, whatever it is, right? So what you basically have to do, and before you analyze them, and this is something some people do, although I can't do very well, is to try and elicit a bit of an emotional response from your judges, right? So if you want, you can just put in a fancy one-liner about how these people are like super oppressed or something like that, if that suits your fancy. And then I think you can do a few things, right? So after you sort of list out who your key actors are, now I'm not saying you have to list it out during your speech. You don't necessarily have to say that, okay, this is going to affect A, economies, B, whatever, workers, etc. You can do it if you want to, but I'm just saying it like this right now for the sake of clarity. So once you have your key actors, right, there are a few questions that you need to answer. First is, what does status quo look like for them? What are they currently doing? What are the conditions that they exist in? Are they good? Are they bad? what are the problems. This motion exists for a reason, right? Perhaps there are some problems that they face right now, which this motion is aiming to solve. What are those problems? What do you intend to do with them? What is their condition right now, right? The second thing you want to think about is what part of status quo can they control, right? So what is the influence that they have, if at all? If you're talking about an ion motion or an econ motion, perhaps, where you're talking about companies or something like that, right? The third thing is what parts of status quo can control them, right? So the different effects. So, for instance, patriarchy working over women, or racism working against people of color, things like that, right? So that's what you want to think about. And then you want to think about why is your model or your policy best suited towards them, right? So this is going to be basically mechanisms when you're going to prove why your side of the world is better. The next thing you have to think about is, after you've talked about these key actors, who they are, what they look like, what they can control, you want to think about why do they matter, right? So they matter because they're perhaps the most in number, perhaps they're extremely vulnerable, or that the depth of impact you have on your side of the house is a lot more than what you have on the other side of the house. Or if you stand for a certain cause or a certain policy, you want to prove that their lives get a lot better as compared to other people's lives getting worse. Something like that, right? Because there's a trade-off. My point is that when there's a trade-off and you're basically working for these individuals, you want to be able to prove that it's worth the trade-off by saving them or working towards them, essentially. Okay. And of course, you also have to then prove that why does all of this matter? Why is it so important to save these people or to affect these people, the consequences or the impacts, right? Now, this last part is specifically important, especially in VPs, right? Where there's a good chance that your lower half will steal this as a form of an extension from you and make it a lot more relevant. So if you just forget to prove why what you're doing is so important or why these individuals are so important, there's a likelihood that your back half will capitalize on that and get away with an extension. So it's important that you complete your argumentation in that sense, right? And I think it's especially important when you're in like OG or OO that you make sure that your argumentation is as comprehensive as possible and don't leave out any like small loopholes. Okay, cool. Let's then look at characterization of clashes, right? Cool. Now, I think this is important just to make your first speaker speech extremely relevant. What tends to happen is you'll come, you will give out your positive case, and you will go, and you will not make any comparisons. The issue with not being comparative or not understanding what is it that you're giving up in your first speech in order to achieve the goals on your side of the house is that you will not be able to predict what the other side is going to say. And a lot of what you perhaps say will be selectively rebutted by the other side. What being comparative does is that it forces the other side to engage with the comparative that you set out. What is the comparative? It's just really simple. If you're saying that X happens on our side of the house, on the same breath, Y happens on your side of the house, and that's a bad thing. That's just drawing a comparative, basically, on every argumentation. Now, like I said, it's important to do this so that the other side doesn't come and conveniently pick what to rebut or conveniently twist your words, right? A comparative claim or a comparative case makes a case extremely watertight and the first speaker's speech really relevant. Because what will happen is that if you're not comparative, the other side will come and conveniently engage. Then your deputy will have to come and like untangle that entire mess and be super comparative and just rehash and have to make sure that the case is right and just untangle a lot of it instead of actually furthering your case. And in that bargain, the first speaker's speech becomes irrelevant, right? Like you're just like, what did you do in those 7 minutes? Like, सब कुछ तो वापस आके बोलना पड़ा second speaker को, right? So you have to be comparative. Otherwise, it's a great danger of your speech just not being relevant enough. Okay. What does being comparative really mean, right? I think you have to first recognize what is it that you're triggering off. Okay, guys, basically, I just want to also give a quick side note. I'm using a lot of these like super technical terms, and they usually have very simple explanations. So in case anybody is confused about what is it that I'm saying, just like ask me, okay? Because I'm just assuming that people know what it means, and sometimes just I forget to explain. So just stop me and ask me if you don't understand something. Okay, actually, this is my cue. I'm going to take a short break and ask if people have questions so far. Tips on ascertaining burden. It's not that tough, right? All you just say is that, look, this is our burden. This is the or perhaps, as some people like to say, this is the metric you have to judge the debate on. It's like super simple. Okay. So, for example, let's take the example of the rainbow capitalism motion again. Right? Say you're regretting that motion. What is your burden in that debate? Your burden is to prove that corporations perhaps end up getting away with a lot of the exploitative practices that they're doing, or that those exploitative practices get a whole lot worse. On the same breath, it is opposition's burden to prove that there comes some sort of benefit out of those, and that is actually helpful towards members of the community. It's that easy. There's nothing like complex in it. But it's really important to say that this is what they have to prove. Otherwise, there is a chance that they will try and prove something really easy and get away with it. So that's just burdening. You just have to say that this is what we have to prove. This is what they have to prove. Or sometimes people like using the word metric. This is the metric of the debate, which is basically the yardstick that you have to judge the debate upon. So that is that. Okay, any more questions at all so far before I continue?
I have one question. If we are the prime minister, we just have to give a speech, right? But if we are in the opening opposition, we are the leader of opposition, we have to entail the rebuttals as well in that speech.
Yeah.
How to balance both of these, like rebutting as well as giving our own speech? What should come first in that, any chronology?
Okay, so here's the thing, right? The best way to rebut is to integrate your rebuttals. Now, if you're on like OO, right? Your job in prep is to also preempt some of what OG would likely say. So to a certain degree, there are basic things that you would have already preempted and would have answers to in your speech, right? The second thing is to integrate your rebuttals. I don't think it's a very good idea to just list down rebuttals in the beginning of your speech or in the end of your speech, but try and make them comparative. An easy way to start by doing this, because I know it is a little bit tough to do, is that while you have written down your notes, I like to number my arguments, okay, very carefully. This 1, 2, 3, 4, and when I in my separate sheet, when I write the points that the other side is making, and I realize that, okay, you know what, I have an answer to this. One of my argumentation is basically a form of answer to this argument that they're trying to make. I will put the serial number beside the corresponding serial number of the argument beside the claim that the other side is making, right? So I know that while I'm making this argument, I also have to mention that I'm responding to this claim made by the other side, right? Or perhaps you rephrase it in a way that it seems like you're answering or rebutting the claim being made by the other side, and just in a way that you're just furthering your own positive argument, right? So short answer, integrator, rebuttals.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Can you give an example on how to describe the relevance of the context using a motion? Okay. Let's see. Relevance of the context. Okay, let's take an example similar that I took before, right? Say it's something like this house supports Western countries exporting democracy to other countries. Okay, or this house supports the US exporting democracy to other countries. If you're Gov and you want to contextualize this motion, you want to set it in reasonable countries, right? Like developing countries or like the Middle Eastern countries where this has actually happened. Uh, Perhaps you can talk about, look, we're going to set this motion in the context of developing countries or countries which perhaps have democracies, which us, or perhaps which have some sort of, what do you say, are going to be a little more receptive to the US, and therefore it's probably going to be a little more convenient for it to take place. And this is relevant merely because this is the only way to do it with the least amount of bloodshed or the least amount of clashes, right? Otherwise, if you want to go ahead and do it in a country like China, they're going to shoot your heads off, and it's going to be a really bloody affair. My point is that you want to explain the context. Why is it that you're setting in a certain context? So you want to say something like, they're probably going to be more receptive. There's probably going to be some sort of diplomatic talks involved in the process. They're going to be amenable to the US, perhaps because they're US allies, but perhaps because the US has something to offer to them in return, or they have something to offer to the US in return. Perhaps their heads have shown some sort of tendencies towards liking democracy, so they have a strong protest culture. Perhaps this has happened in the past before, something like that. If you want to back it up with some claims like that, you obviously can't place it in like Russia or China, where nobody's going to care at all. So that. When is it advisable to give a counter policy rather than defending status quo? What do you mean? Okay. I think this depends from motion to motion. I don't think I don't think I have a really like straightforward answer to this. If you think that status quo is working, and okay, so usually the way it works is that if the motion itself suggests a new policy and you're expected to oppose it, you are expected to defend status quo. It usually works that way, right? But if you're like regretting something, or you have or that you're or that you're regretting something that's already existing, then perhaps you have to provide a new counter policy. That's how it like usually works, right? Like if you're expected to regret something that's already existing, then obviously you have to come up with something new to defend, and something new to say that this is going to be better because clearly something in status quo is not working. So perhaps in motions like that. But whenever you're asked to oppose something and you're on the side of a new policy being proposed and you're supposed to oppose it or something like that, it's usually extremely advisable for you to defend just status quo. Don't try to come up with something new. It's just taking upon an unnecessary burden upon yourself. Okay, do we have more questions? No problem. Okay, no questions. Let's move on then. Feel free to drop in or like ask questions in between as well. Like if I'll just forget to stop, okay? Just ask me questions then and there, especially if your question pertains to something that I'm talking about at the moment. It'll just be a lot more clear for everybody as well. Okay, where was I? I think I was in characterization of clashes and like putting trade-offs and things like that, okay? What is a trade-off? Basically, trade-off means that while you're trying to achieve something on your side of the house, you're obviously there are going to be some compromises. There's something that you're going to lose out on. That is why a debate exists, right? There's no perfect solution, which is why both the sides are trying to argue that their side of the policy is better. Now, what you have to do in a debate is prove that whatever policy you're proposing is better than whatever you're giving up on. Like it's worth it, basically, than whatever you're losing out on, right? So usually trade-off is the mechanism. So a lot of times you want to achieve the same goals, but the question is with respect to who can prove their claims better, which is a better path to victory, right? Um, so, sorry. Uh, so, for instance, most minority and feminist motions revolve on this principle, right? The disputed consequence, not disputed, sorry, undisputed consequence that you're going to arrive at is to make the lives of minority individuals a lot better, right? That's not a consequence you can dispute in a minority motion. That's a given. That is what everybody has to work on. That's the consequence both sides have to work on. The question is which is a better mechanism towards achieving that goal, right? So you pick up any feminist motion, any minority motion, this is the principle that revolves around, right? So when you're trying to achieve the same goal, often the mechanisms are going to be different. So you essentially have to prove why your mechanism is going to work a lot better, is going to be a lot more effective or useful than the other side's mechanism, right? That's basically your argument as well. The other thing could be that you're trying to achieve different goals. And while you're trying to achieve different goals, the other side stakeholders might lose out in the process. So you want to identify that. Perhaps you can prove that those are really small in number, or you can say that they are not as important, or that they can be taken care of by other means, something like that, right? So that's one way. Those are the types of trade-offs. How do you explain those then, and how do you make an argument out of it? So the first and obvious thing is that whose benefit are you trading off? Are these individuals important? Can they be taken care of in other ways? Are they a huge, are they a huge number? And why is it worth it, right? I think this is intuitive, right? Like you have to prove the effectivity of your mechanism essentially. And then the same thing you can talk about is integrating it with who your actors was. So this section essentially has to be integrated with your actor analysis. Let's see how this works as a whole now. I've just explained it to you in like a really complex manner, right? So you explain your actors. Say, for instance, it's a group of women, right? You explain that, look, the best way to achieve emancipation of women is the mechanism that we are suggesting. Perhaps suggest to let them pay lesser taxes. Okay, something like that. Once you've proven that, you also have to prove why is it the case that these individuals are going to be better off? Why is it the case that these individuals can control certain parts of status quo, or they can't control certain parts of status quo? All of the questions that we did before, right? And then you prove that, okay, because these individuals can do this or can't do this and can control these parts or can't control these parts, are important because they are perhaps more vulnerable, or perhaps they're more in number, or perhaps they're deeply affected by this motion, we say that this is the trade-off that's worth it. Got it? So I just explained to you everything alag say, but it all has to be done together. So you explain who the actors are, you explain how they react and how they behave, and then in the end, you show me why is it worth making that trade-off. Okay. Cool. Now, it's important to do this because you want to get your priorities right in the debate. A lot of times what happens is the back half, we will reprioritize the debate and say that, look, these set of individuals are perhaps not as important as what the OG talked about, but we'll give you another set of individuals who are important and another set of stakeholders who are important. And it's more worth the trade-off when we are trying to protect these people as opposed to who OG was trying to protect, something like that, right? So it's super important to prove why is it worth the trade-off completely, because then you're proving that your actors that you're trying to save are also the most important ones in the debate, because they're the ones who make the trade-off the most worth it. Okay, so that's the idea behind all of it. How do you integrate rebuttals then, right? So if you've mostly done your argumentation well, It won't be too hard to do this as well, right? Most of your job is essentially done because you have implicitly preempted the strongest arguments coming from the other side and you have rebutted them. The best way to think about it during prep or to sort of rebut it is to think about what is the best version of ops case. What goals is op going to try to achieve? What mechanisms are they using? And why are none of them worth it? Okay. Now it's super important to take some time out of prep and think about these things in order to make relevant arguments. Because a lot of times when you don't think about what the other side is going to make, you might end up making arguments which don't attack the strongest claims coming from the other side. And then your second speaker will have to do a lot of work to rebut them, and there just wouldn't be enough time. So I think that is with respect to the content of it. Some of it was a little complex, and I know it's like super theory based, but if you had to take away some like key points from it, at least at this stage, I would say that pay attention to your contexts, make sure that they're as detailed as possible. Think about a model that you're going to try and make. Think about the arguments that you're making. Make sure you've covered all of these stakeholders. Make sure you have sort of thought about how they interact with the kind of policy you're trying to propose or how they exist in status quo. What are the problems that they face, etc. How can you make their lives better by the policy that you're suggesting? And what are the impacts that are going to be had on these individuals? And why do you think it's just worth saving these individuals as opposed to whatever the other side's going to say? Okay, so let's look at the structure of your speech, right? And what your speech should basically entail. I think the first thing should be context and framing. The second thing should be your model. Then come your burdens. Then you have to have your arguments, right? So within your arguments, there's a certain structure that you can follow. So say you have argument number one. Within that, you set your premise, then you have your analysis, then you have the relevance or just proving why that argument is important at all. And then you just link it back to what the motion was. Now, this last part is something that we usually always miss. We make arguments and then leave it, and then nobody knows what connection it had to the emotion at all, right? Like you go on to prove why patriarchy sucks and things like that, but you don't tie it back to why, because of this X thing happened, which we are aiming to solve via the motion. These are things you have to explicitly state. I know that they seem really obvious when you're making claims or when you're making arguments, but judges get super confused when you're throwing around, like so many teams are throwing around so many claims and nobody knows why anything is important. So, and again, then you go with the same structure for your next argument. You go premise, analysis, relevance, and linking it back to the motion. Okay, cool. A few things now so this is basically in terms of what you should be doing, right? Like, I know it sounds a little complex, but what I'm going to say is that try and develop something that works for you. Okay, everything that I told you right now is the ideal PM speech. You will not, obviously, nobody is going to be that good to be able to incorporate every single thing in every single speech that you give. Like, I have never done it for one. But try and pick up one thing to improve upon and keep a few headings in mind, right? Like, I use a different terminology to perhaps explain the same thing that you're already doing. And most of you would probably already be doing it in your speeches. It's just that you probably don't realize that you're doing it, right? So try and the next time you're giving a speech, perhaps really record it and perhaps listen to it again and try and think about what are the things that you did from this list, perhaps, or what are the things you missed and what you could have done, right? There are no hard and fast rules of making a PM speech. These are just the components that I usually find Useful to think about. I'm sure you can come up with your own ways to strategize and give a speech that works best for you, right? A few final notes then. I think the biggest problem I face with the first speech is that, and people ask me this all the time, is that how do you deal with the time crunch? You have very little time. You've also not heard anybody in the debate before. How do you sort of deal with that? And I don't have a hack for this actually, but my advice would be that if you intend on being the first speaker for any debate or whatever, just practice as much as you can. There's no point hiding. There's no point avoiding it. Just go for it. And the more number of times you mess up as a first speaker, the more confident you will be as you go ahead. Like after a certain point, it doesn't really get worse. It doesn't get worse than finishing a speech in 2 minutes, does it? It's fine. It's not going to be the end of the world. So try and practice as much as you can. And you will eventually get better with time. Like there's no easy way to fix it. There's no easy way to predict. Like that you're always going to be hit with motions that you know nothing about, and you're just going to have to go and give your speech as the prime minister without having heard anybody in the debate. Honestly, fake it till you make it. Just that's all I'm going to say about that. It's okay. Like we all mess up sometime or the other. It's not the end of the world. Okay. Another thing that I really stressed on the beginning of my speech is, like beginning of the session rather, is to write down your speeches in as much detail as you can. Trust me, it's quite life changing. I used to take down quite quick notes before. Like you'll get your rhythm in it. Okay, so when I first started out, I didn't know what to write, right? Like when we were discussing cases, I was just like, oh my God, there's so much content being thrown around. I don't know what to write. Like, is this even relevant? Like, what if we just decide to toss this argument out of the window by the end of prep? So obviously as you practice, you'll realize the things that you need to pick up and the way you need to form sentences and write and the way it works for you. But in the beginning, at least, just write down as much as you can. Remember, it is easier to cut down things later than to try and remember what had been said during prep and then keep adding it to your speech, right? So eventually, as you keep writing, you'll realize that, okay, like this is the key things I need to pick up. This is the style of note making that works best for me. This is the sentence formation that works best for me, etc., etc. Right? Because you obviously can't write down your speech word for word. It's just a matter of practice. But my advice would be to just write as much as you can. Okay, cool. So another, I think, question that boggled me for the greatest time was, especially being an ESL speaker, I was somebody who could never give like super fancy or rhetoric speeches, right? And the issue was that when I was first starting out, most people recommended these super like white debaters giving really fancy rhetoric speeches, like people from like Oxford and Harvard and like Poseo's famous 2016, that world final speech, which was extremely fancy. What I realized is that is not the definition of a good first speech. Of course, there are great speeches, like there's no doubt about it. But I think we have to realize that our limitations in terms of the way we speak English, and that should not deter us from giving good PM speeches. So, first off, if you're able to use fancy rhetoric and fancy language in your first speech, go for it. That's great. Like, eliciting a response and being super intuitive and emotional is a really good strength of being a good first speaker, undoubtedly. But if you can't do that, then that's completely fine as well. You can do something that I do all the time, is to say that 3 things that I'm going to do in the speech, start listing them down, make as many lists and numbers and subheaders as you can, right? If you can't be fancy, at least intimidate them with the number of points you have. So that would be my advice, right? And I know like when I first started out debating, at least, and I heard these first speakers, they were extremely fancy, and I could never emulate them. And I thought I would never be a good like first speaker because I couldn't do that. But truth be told, the more simple you are, the better it is. Try and be as simple and clear as possible. Make sure that you're not using unnecessary jargon. Make every word count would be my advice. And it's fine. A great, like if you find yourself losing out to teams who use a lot of rhetoric, start pointing out flaws in their mechanisms. This is a great tool, right? Like if they're like really like fancy, but like most of the time, like people who are fancy who give empty speeches. So try and like pick out the flaws, point out to the judges, this is the mechanism that they missed. This is something that they didn't explain. They just used fancy words to explain one point, but it had no substance at all. There was no analysis, no mechanism to prove that claim. XYZ was a loophole in that claim, etc., etc. So the reason I'm just telling you all of this is because on the internet you won't find a lot of good ESL first speakers, first speeches which are being glorified, but there are a lot of them. Trust me on that. You don't need to like use fancy rhetoric to be a good first speaker at all. Okay. How do you deal with messing up at a prime minister's speech? I think the first thing you just have to remember is that it's part of the process. I've messed up a lot of times. Like actually, just last year and at UADC at our first out round, like we broke, and then like the first out round that we did, I made a really silly mistake in my first speech, and I almost like conceded the debate, and that basically just I didn't concede to it, but I like almost conceded, which basically just made it super easy for the other side to like twist claims, and then they went on to win. My point is that you make mistakes all the time, and you at some point just have to suck it up and have to remember that it's all part of the process, and that you will not make the same mistake again. A good thing to do is to keep a list of the mistakes that you thought you made. Be a little conscious, a little aware, or ask your partner to write down things and to help you identify what those were in order to improve upon them later. And then try and rectify one thing at a time. Okay? Like I just told you I just gave you what an ideal like first speaker speech should look like and all of the components. But obviously you're going to take a really long time to perfect the first speaker speech. So it might get really overwhelming to work at everything all at once. So I would just say try and work at one thing at a time. You're obviously going to find tons of mistake every time you give a speech, but make sure that you pick one thing to work on and you try and improve upon that for a few practices, and then take upon the next thing, right? You have to be just really slow and patient with the process. Lastly, just learn to give prime minister speeches from people around you. Go on YouTube, try and look at speeches of Asian speakers, perhaps of ESL speakers specifically, and see the tools that they employ. One of my absolute favorite speeches, first speaker speeches, is the speech of the final speech of what's her name? The Australian debater whose name I've forgotten, but it's the 2020 Austral's final speech of the PM. Absolutely brilliant speech, very basic, ticks off every single basic thing you have to do. Not very fancy at all, very clear, very comparative, and just a really good speech, right? And I'm sure you guys will find a lot of speeches like that by other speakers as well. So do that, see what works for you. I'm sure you guys like while you're doing debate practices or while you attend tournaments as well, you must come across people who would give really good speeches. You can definitely observe, and like you have to be smart while you're picking up cues, right? Obviously, you can't just like outrightly go and copy what somebody's saying. But you can definitely try and pick up some elements that you think you can also incorporate while you're giving speeches. So I think that is what I would say about that. Do we have any questions before we move on to the small demo thing? Tips for taking POIs, both giving and taking. Okay, so giving POIs. First of all, please make them short. You're not giving out an argument while you are giving a POI. you want to try and dent their case as much as possible. So try and make a POI extremely strategic, something that's going to make them struggle to give an answer, right? Uh, don't ask POIs on frivolous stuff like why is this your context or something like that. You really want to like I remember this one time we were closing opposition in a debate, and Kevin asked a POI to be OG, which basically made them knife their own case, and they were out of the debate on that POI itself. So you want to give really, really strong, powerful POIs, which like can really dent cases. First is that. So you think when you give POIs. While taking POIs, by taking, do you mean like what should you like? How should you answer them? Like, is that your question?
Yeah, basically, how to like take them, like how should you proceed towards them?
How should you proceed towards them? So personally, I take POIs at 5:30 or 5:45. I don't take a POI before that. But it depends from speaker to speaker. Some people like taking POIs early on, if there's a POI offered early on, or because there could be a good chance that, if they've offered a POI so early in your speech, there's something really important to be clarified, and you want to pick on that and clarify it as soon as you can, or instead of waiting till the end and giving them a chance to point it out during their speeches, and then you having to waste more time, untangle it in your second speech, etc. So you have to gauge what you really want to do. But if you think you're super confident of your case, it also depends from team to team sometimes. If you think that it's a really good team, then you want to take their POI early on. But if you're uncomfortable and you're super confident of your case, etc., you can take it later on. But definitely take a POI. Please take a POI, especially when you're first speaker. I highly encourage it, and it's just good faith debating to take POIs. How do you answer them? Well, it would depend on what the POI is, right? I would say don't shy away from it and don't beat around the bush, would be my general advice for it. Try and be as specific as possible, bite the bullet and explain it. If you already have an existing argument and you think that you've already made an argument with respect to that, you can just say, okay, I've already referred to this and quickly answer it. But don't uh, don't shy away from POI, or don't just shrug it off unless you really have to, unless you think it's really, really stupid and something you've already quite obviously addressed before. Even in that case, just try and quickly answer what it is. So that's in POIs. Any more questions, guys? Okay, cool. Seeing that there are none, I think we can